Kenny was taking his usual evening walk, trying to unwind after a long day. The city was quieter now, the streets emptying out as the sun set. He enjoyed these walks, just him, the cool evening air, and a few minutes to clear his mind. The streetlights flickered on as he strolled through the quiet neighborhood, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the pavement. He was passing by an old row of houses when he saw something unusual. A dog. It was sitting by the side of the road, staring straight ahead, unmoving. It was a scruffy thing, nothing remarkable about it except that it looked different, calm, almost like it was waiting for someone. Most stray dogs he saw were either looking for food or running around, but this one just sat there, still as a statue. Kenny slowed down and looked at the dog. It looked back at him, its brown eyes soft, but alert. The dog didn't show any fear, just curiosity, as if it knew Kenny was coming. He took a few steps closer, half expecting the dog to run off, but instead it just wagged its tail slightly, still staring at him. "Hey there," Kenny said softly, kneeling down to get a better look. The dog didn't move, just continued to watch him. Kenny noticed something odd, a symbol on the dog's collar. It wasn't a normal tag. It was old, the edges worn down by time, and engraved on it was a strange symbol, a crescent moon with an eye in the center. It didn't look like anything he had seen before. Kenny reached down to touch the collar, examining the symbol carefully. There was no name or address on the tag, just that strange marking. He felt a sudden curiosity. Why was this dog out here, with no owner and with a symbol like that? The dog seemed to sense Kenny's confusion. It stood up and took a few steps back, still watching him. Then it sat down again, as if waiting for Kenny to make the next move. Kenny stood up slowly, glancing around. The street was still empty, the evening quiet. It was as if the dog had appeared out of nowhere. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to it. There was something about the dog, the symbol on its collar. It felt like something important was happening. "All right, let's get you inside," Kenny muttered to himself. The dog looked at him again, its eyes calm, as if it understood. He extended his hand slowly toward the dog, and this time it didn't hesitate. The dog sniffed his hand, then nuzzled it gently. Kenny smiled, a little surprised by how calm the dog was. He stood up and gestured for the dog to follow. It did, without a second thought, trotting alongside him as they walked back to his apartment. Kenny glanced down at the dog every now and then. It was strange. This dog wasn't acting like the others he had seen. There was a quiet intelligence in its movements, something that made him wonder if it had a purpose, if it had come to find him for a reason. As they reached his apartment building, the dog followed him inside without any hesitation. Kenny opened the door to his apartment, and the dog slipped in after him, sitting down by the door as if it had done this 1,000 times before. Kenny closed the door behind them, the silence of the apartment settling in around him. He looked down at the dog, still confused by the symbol on its collar, and decided he would have to figure out what it meant. But for now he was content to sit and relax. The dog had made itself at home, and Kenny wasn't about to turn it away. As he sat down on the couch, the dog curled up at his feet, its eyes closing as if it were already comfortable. Kenny picked up the strange collar and stared at the symbol again. What was it trying to tell him? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear: this encounter was the beginning of something that was about to change his life. Kenny sat in his apartment, staring down at the dog lying peacefully at his feet. The quiet stillness of the room felt oddly comforting, but something about the dog and the strange symbol on its collar kept his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just a random meeting. The dog had been so calm, almost as if it had known him, and that symbol, engraved so clearly on its collar, seemed like it was meant to be noticed. The crescent moon with an eye in the center. He had never seen anything like it before. He reached down, gently lifting the dog's collar, and studied the symbol again. The collar was old, the leather frayed from wear, but the symbol remained clear, almost as if it had been carved yesterday. Kenny turned it over, hoping to find a name or an address, but there was nothing. Just the symbol, like a secret waiting to be unlocked. He could feel his curiosity growing by the minute. Who had put this collar on the dog? What did it mean? Kenny placed the collar down on the coffee table, trying to focus. He had been researching for a while now, looking up anything he could about the symbol online, but nothing came up. No matches, no results, just dead ends. It was as if the symbol didn't exist in any modern database. Kenny frowned, wondering if there was something he was missing. The dog stirred, lifting its head and watching him. Kenny smiled faintly, wondering if it could somehow sense his thoughts. "All right, buddy," he muttered, standing up. "Let's see if we can figure this out." Kenny walked over to his desk and started flipping through old books he had accumulated over the years. Most were about history, some about symbols and mythology, but none mentioned anything like the one on the collar. He grabbed a notebook and sketched the symbol out. His hand moved automatically as his mind raced, trying to make connections. The dog moved closer, sitting next to him and watching him intently. Its eyes were alert but calm, like it was waiting for something. Kenny paused, feeling a strange connection. Was this dog somehow leading him to something, or was it simply a coincidence? He returned to his research, but the more he looked, the more frustrated he became. The symbol appeared in nothing he could find, no historical records, no mythology, no religion, nothing. But then, something odd happened. As Kenny scribbled down a few more notes, his pen brushed against the desk, knocking over a small jar he had kept on the edge. It rolled off, and as it hit the floor, Kenny saw something strange. A piece of paper, tucked beneath a stack of books, was exposed as the jar rolled across the floor. Kenny bent down, intrigued. He had no idea how it had gotten there, but it looked like an old, folded note. He opened it carefully, almost as if it were a relic, and read the message inside. The symbol leads to the gate. Follow the path before it is too late. Kenny stared at the note for a long moment, confusion and excitement bubbling up inside him. The gate? He didn't understand. Was this a clue? Was this message meant for him? His eyes darted over to the dog, who was now standing, its tail wagging gently, as if it had been waiting for him to discover the next step. Kenny had no answers, but the message was clear. Something bigger was at play, something that had to do with the symbol. And this dog had brought him here, to this point. He had to follow it. "Guess we're not done yet," Kenny muttered to the dog, who let out a soft bark, almost as if in agreement. The next morning, Kenny felt the weight of the message on the note still hanging over him. It wasn't just a coincidence, he was certain of it. The dog, the symbol, the cryptic note, it all pointed to something bigger. But where did he begin? What was this gate the note referred to? And why had it been left for him to find? The dog had slept soundly through the night, but as soon as Kenny stood up from the couch, it was awake and alert, tail wagging slightly. Kenny couldn't help but wonder if the dog knew more about this mystery than he did. After all, it had led him here. It was only a matter of time before they uncovered more. Kenny grabbed the map from the drawer, just a basic city map, but when he looked at it, he felt a sense of determination. He traced his finger along the streets, wondering if something, anything, would stand out. He tried to focus on the message, follow the path before it is too late. What did that mean? What path? Where was the gate? The dog barked suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts. Kenny looked down, and the dog was at the door, sitting by it, staring up at him expectantly. For a moment, Kenny wondered if the dog was trying to tell him something, leading him to the next clue, perhaps. Without wasting any time, he grabbed his coat and keys. "All right, let's go," Kenny said to the dog, who stood and trotted happily toward the door. They stepped outside, and the dog led him down the street. Kenny was now fully aware that this wasn't just a walk. They were heading somewhere with purpose, and the dog was leading the way. Kenny had no idea where they were going, but he trusted the dog's instincts. As they walked through the city, Kenny noticed that the dog seemed to be heading toward a more industrial area, full of old buildings and warehouses. It was a place Kenny wasn't particularly familiar with, but the dog moved confidently, pulling him along. After a few blocks, they arrived at an old, abandoned building on the corner. The windows were boarded up, the paint chipped and fading. The dog stopped in front of the building and sat, looking up at Kenny. Kenny hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision. Should he go inside? Was this the next clue? He took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. The door was unlocked, creaking as it opened. Inside, it was dark and musty. Dust hung in the air, and the place smelled like it had been abandoned for years. The dog moved inside first, sniffing around the room before heading toward a large, worn door at the back. Kenny followed closely, his heart racing. What was waiting behind that door? What was this place? The dog paused at the door, looking back at Kenny with eyes that seemed to say, "This is it." He reached for the door handle, the creaking of the hinges sounding louder than usual in the silence of the building. Slowly he opened it. Behind the door, there was nothing, just a small wooden chest, sitting in the middle of the room. Kenny knelt down, curious. As he opened the chest, he found something unexpected, an old, crumpled note inside. The message on the note was simple, yet it sent a chill down his spine. "The path begins. You are being watched. The gate is closer than you think." Kenny's breath caught in his throat. This was the beginning. Kenny stared at the crumpled note in his hand, trying to absorb the cryptic message. "The path begins. You are being watched. The gate is closer than you think." His heart pounded as his mind raced. He had no idea what the note meant, but it was clear that it was another clue in a puzzle he wasn't sure he could solve. The dog, calm as ever, stood beside him, its head tilted slightly as if waiting for Kenny's next move. Kenny glanced down at the dog and then around the room. The abandoned warehouse was eerily quiet, filled with dust and the scent of old wood. He noticed that the chest he had opened was the only thing in the room. There was nothing else to suggest any other hidden messages, no obvious clues. He stood up, running his fingers through his hair. The gate? What did it mean? And why was he involved in all of this? The feeling of being watched lingered in the back of his mind, making his skin crawl. He needed to get out of here and figure out his next move. But as he turned toward the door, the dog barked sharply, pulling him back. Kenny froze. The dog was standing still, ears perked up, its gaze fixed on one of the walls. At first, Kenny didn't understand, but the dog moved toward the wall, sniffing the air, and then started scratching at the floor near the baseboard. Kenny approached cautiously, his curiosity growing. The dog had done this before, led him to something hidden. Was there something behind this wall? He knelt down beside the dog and examined the area more closely. The wall looked normal, but something felt off. He ran his hand along the surface and, to his surprise, felt a small indentation. It was almost invisible, but Kenny could tell it was there. He pressed it, and the wall gave way with a quiet click. A hidden door. Kenny's breath caught in his chest as the door creaked open, revealing a dark passageway leading deeper into the building. The dog immediately stepped inside, looking back to make sure Kenny was following. Kenny hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the darkness. The air was colder here, and the smell of damp stone filled his nose. The passage was narrow, and Kenny had to walk carefully, his footfalls echoing in the quiet. The dog led the way, its movements sure and steady. Kenny followed closely, not sure what to expect, but feeling more and more like he was walking into something much bigger than he had anticipated. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a large room. The walls were lined with shelves, stacked with old books, papers, and objects that looked ancient. It was like a hidden library, but something about the room felt off, almost as if it had been left behind in a hurry. The dog walked toward one of the shelves, then stopped, its eyes fixed on an object resting on a pedestal in the center of the room. It was a small, intricately carved box, made of dark wood and brass. Kenny felt a pull toward it, a strange compulsion that he couldn't explain. He moved closer, and as he reached out to touch it, the dog growled softly, as if warning him. Kenny paused, looking down at the dog, but the dog was still and steady, its gaze unblinking. Was this safe? Was this what the note had meant by "the path begins"? With a deep breath, Kenny ignored the hesitation and picked up the box. As soon as his fingers touched it, the room seemed to vibrate, the air growing thick with energy. Kenny's heart raced as he opened the box, and inside, there was a small piece of paper neatly folded. He unfolded it carefully and read the message. "You are on the right path. The gate is close, but so is the danger. The key is in your hands." Kenny closed the box and looked at the dog. Whatever this was, whatever he had stumbled into, it was bigger than he could have imagined. The gate, whatever that meant, was close, and now he had the key. Kenny stood in the hidden room, the weight of the small box in his hands pulling him into the mystery even deeper. He glanced at the dog, whose calm demeanor seemed to reassure him. Whatever was happening, the dog had led him here. The note in the box had said, "The key is in your hands." He could feel it now. The key wasn't just the box. It was something more. The path had been set, but Kenny had no idea where it would lead him. The dog stood and moved toward a dark corner of the room, its attention fixed on something else. Kenny followed, intrigued by the dog's behavior. It stopped in front of a dusty bookshelf, its eyes narrowing. The dog scratched at the floor again, revealing more hidden symbols, these carved into the wood. The bookshelf itself seemed to be another part of the mystery. Without thinking, Kenny moved closer and pulled the shelf open, revealing another hidden passage. This time, it was a narrow stairway that led down into complete darkness. The air was thick with must, the scent of earth and time long forgotten. Kenny hesitated for only a moment before taking the first step, the dog right behind him. They descended into the depths, the stairs creaking under their weight. Kenny's flashlight barely cut through the blackness ahead, and the further they went, the colder it became. His breath formed clouds in the air, and a strange silence pressed down on him. The dog moved with a quiet certainty, as if it knew the way. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached a thick steel door. The dog paused in front of it, staring up at Kenny as if waiting for a command. Kenny inspected the door, noticing a series of strange symbols etched into its surface. It was an ancient-looking lock, but Kenny had the key, the small box. Kenny reached into his pocket and pulled out the box, feeling its weight in his hands. He took a deep breath, then inserted the box into the keyhole. To his surprise, the lock clicked open with a smooth, quiet sound. The door creaked as it slowly opened, revealing a hidden underground lab. Inside, the room was filled with large, complex equipment, machines that looked like they belonged to another time. The walls were lined with old, faded charts and monitors, many of which were still powered on though flickering. At the center of the room, there was a large glass tank filled with some sort of liquid. Inside, suspended in the liquid, was an object, something Kenny couldn't make out in the dim light, but it looked important, almost like it was the source of all the secrets he had uncovered so far. The dog walked toward the tank, its eyes locked on the object inside. Kenny followed, his heart pounding. What was this place? What had they discovered? The dog seemed to know exactly where to go, and Kenny couldn't help but wonder if the answers were just within reach. As Kenny stepped closer to the tank, a low hum filled the room, the lights flickering as if the entire lab was coming to life. Whatever had been waiting here for so long was stirring, and Kenny knew that the mystery was only beginning to unfold. Kenny stood in the underground lab, the hum of machinery filling the air. The object inside the glass tank seemed to pulse with energy, though Kenny couldn't understand what it was. His eyes darted back to the dog, who was standing still, watching the tank with unwavering focus. It was almost as if the dog recognized what was inside, as though it understood the importance of the discovery. Kenny moved closer to the tank, his footsteps quiet on the cold concrete floor. The strange liquid inside the tank shimmered, and Kenny could just make out the faint outline of an object within. It was metallic, gleaming even in the dim light. His instincts told him that this was the key to everything. The gate, the symbol, the messages. This was what it all led to. Suddenly, the dog's ears perked up. It turned sharply and bolted toward the entrance of the lab, its movements swift and purposeful. Kenny's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Before Kenny could react, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above, echoing down the narrow passage. It was too late to escape. Someone was coming. Kenny rushed to the door, but the dog was already there, barking and pawing at the steel door as if it knew time was running out. Kenny quickly followed, his pulse racing. He knew he had to get out of there. Whatever was happening, the people pursuing him were not going to let him walk away with what he had discovered. He grabbed the dog's collar and pulled it toward the hidden stairway, but as he turned to head back up, the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A group of masked figures appeared at the top, their silhouettes backlit by the harsh light from above. Kenny froze. He recognized them from earlier encounters, the same people who had been following him, the ones who had been watching him since the moment he found the dog. They had finally caught up. Kenny's mind raced. He had to make a decision, fight or run. The dog, still calm and focused, stood beside him, ready for whatever was coming. Kenny didn't have the luxury of time to think it through. He grabbed the dog and ran toward the side door of the lab, his footsteps pounding against the floor. The figures at the top of the stairs shouted, but Kenny didn't look back. The hidden door creaked open as Kenny shoved it with all his strength, pulling the dog behind him. It led into a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch forever. He could hear the footsteps of his pursuers growing louder behind him. The chase had begun. Kenny dashed through the corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog was right behind him, weaving through the narrow passages with surprising agility. Kenny barely had time to react as the hallway twisted, leading them down into another level of the complex. The whole place seemed to be a maze, built to confuse anyone who dared to enter. He rounded a corner and stumbled into a room filled with old machinery, huge machines, some of which looked like they hadn't been touched in years. He didn't have time to examine them. The sound of footsteps was getting closer. The pursuers were nearly there. The dog darted toward the far corner of the room, and Kenny followed, his instincts telling him to trust the animal. The dog stopped in front of a small, rusted door, scratched at it once, and then looked back at Kenny. It was a hidden exit, just the opening Kenny needed. He reached for the door handle and yanked it open, pulling the dog inside. The door slammed shut behind him, and they were in another corridor, but this one was quieter. The sound of pursuit had stopped, for now. Kenny breathed a sigh of relief, but he didn't let his guard down. They weren't out of danger yet. As they moved deeper into the shadows, Kenny realized something crucial. He had just uncovered part of the mystery, but there were still so many questions. Who were these people chasing him? What was inside the tank? And why had the dog led him here? The dog seemed to sense his thoughts and glanced back at him, its eyes steady. Whatever came next, Kenny knew he couldn't face it alone. The dog had already proven itself to be more than just a stray. It was his guide through this tangled web of secrets. Kenny moved cautiously through the underground corridors, the dog leading the way. The dim light from his flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, but he could feel the weight of something pressing down on him. It wasn't just the fear of being chased. It was the gnawing feeling that he was getting closer to something he wasn't ready to fully understand. The dog, sensing his unease, slowed its pace and glanced back at him, its eyes calm but alert. Kenny could feel the tension rising in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? They reached a dead end in the corridor, and the dog stopped, sniffing around the walls. Kenny squatted down, inspecting the area. There was nothing unusual about the walls, except for a small panel near the ground, half covered by dust. He reached for it, brushing off the grime, and noticed a small switch hidden underneath. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Kenny's heart race again. He pressed the switch, and the wall in front of them shifted, revealing a hidden room behind it. The dog stepped forward, pushing through the opening. Kenny followed closely, his hand on the flashlight as they entered the new space. This room was different from the others. It was much smaller, its walls lined with maps, papers, and strange-looking gadgets. A few machines were scattered around the room, their lights flickering weakly. But it wasn't the equipment that caught Kenny's attention. It was the man sitting in the corner, hunched over a desk, scribbling notes. Kenny froze. The man hadn't noticed them yet, his attention focused entirely on the papers in front of him. Kenny could tell by the man's posture that he was no ordinary person. He was too calm, too focused. This wasn't just another lat worker. The dog, sensing the tension, growled softly, a low sound that caught the man's attention. He turned around slowly, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw Kenny standing in the doorway. "You shouldn't be here," the man said flatly, his voice calm but carrying an underlying sense of authority. Kenny took a step back, instinctively reaching for the door behind him. "What is all this? Who are you?" The man stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "My name is Elias, and you're in deeper than you realize." Kenny's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he had been waiting for answers, but the man's cold expression told him he wouldn't get those answers so easily. "Why were you following me?" Kenny pressed, stepping forward. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the dog, which had stopped growling and now sat quietly beside Kenny. "You don't know what you're dealing with. This is bigger than you, bigger than both of us." The tension in the room thickened, and Kenny realized the danger wasn't just physical. The man in front of him knew something Kenny needed to learn, and he was going to have to figure out how to get the truth out of him. But before he could ask another question, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. They were coming closer. "You've overstayed your welcome," Elias said, his voice hardening, "and now you've made it much worse." Kenny's stomach dropped. It was clear Elias wasn't going to be any help. He was part of the problem, and now they had company. Kenny's heart raced as the dog tugged at its collar, leading him swiftly down the narrow passage. The sound of footsteps echoing behind them was getting louder with every step. He could feel the urgency in the air, like the walls themselves were closing in, pushing him to keep moving. He glanced over his shoulder briefly, seeing nothing but darkness at first, but then the dim light from the corridor caught the shadows of figures moving fast in pursuit. He couldn't make out details, but it was clear someone, or something, was after them. The dog, ever calm, pulled Kenny forward with surprising strength. Kenny kept pace, the adrenaline surging through him. Why were they chasing him? He had no answers, but the situation felt far too dangerous to stop and think. The dog seemed to know where to go, its instinct guiding them through the labyrinth of underground corridors. They turned a corner, and Kenny's foot caught on a loose floorboard. He stumbled but quickly regained his balance. The dog didn't falter, darting ahead with purpose. Kenny's breath came in sharp bursts, his legs aching, but he couldn't afford to slow down. The sound of the pursuers grew louder, closer. Kenny knew they were only moments behind. His thoughts raced. Should he stop and fight, or keep running? Neither seemed like a good option, but he didn't have much of a choice. Ahead, the passageway split into two paths. The dog hesitated for a split second before bolting left, its tail held low, its movements calculated. Kenny followed without thinking, hoping the dog's instincts would guide them to safety. They were running out of time. As they sprinted through the hallway, Kenny could hear the growing sound of boots pounding the floor behind them. The footsteps were close now. He risked another glance over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of the pursuers. A group of men dressed in dark, tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. They weren't here for a friendly chat. Kenny picked up the pace, his heart pounding in his chest. They had to find a way out, but the corridors stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of rooms and dead ends. The dog, however, seemed to be getting closer to something. Kenny could sense it. They reached a dead-end hallway, a metal door blocking their path. The dog stopped in front of it, its eyes fixed on the door as it sat down, waiting for Kenny to act. Kenny scrambled to the door, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. He reached for the door handle, only to find it locked. The footsteps were closing in, and he could feel the tension rising. They were running out of options. He glanced down at the dog, who gave him a steady look, almost as if it was waiting for him to make the next move. Desperation kicked in. He pounded on the door, trying to force it open, but nothing gave. Behind him, the footsteps were almost at the end of the corridor. And then, with a sudden lurch, the door swung open. Kenny barely had time to react before the dog darted through it. Kenny followed quickly, slipping through just as the first of the pursuers rounded the corner. They were outside, the cool night air filling Kenny's lungs. The dog led the way, moving faster than Kenny thought possible. The city streets loomed ahead, empty and quiet in the late hours of the night. Kenny barely had time to process what had just happened before the door behind them slammed shut with a metallic thud. He turned around, scanning the area, but the pursuit had stopped, for now. He stood there, breathing heavily, looking at the dog. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered under his breath. The dog didn't answer, of course, but its steady gaze made it clear it wasn't done yet. There was still more to uncover, and Kenny was in this whether he liked it or not. Kenny had no time to catch his breath. The streetlights above him flickered, casting shadows across the empty city streets as he followed the dog through the darkened alley. He was still shaken by the close call inside the building, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. They were safe for now. The feeling of being hunted still lingered, gnawing at him. The dog moved with purpose, its tail low but steady, guiding Kenny through the dark streets as if it knew exactly where to go. Kenny felt strangely at ease in its presence, like he wasn't alone in the chaos. The dog had led him this far, and for some reason, Kenny trusted it more than he trusted anyone else. As they turned another corner, Kenny's senses went on high alert. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, too rhythmic to be just any passerby. He glanced around but saw nothing. Had they been followed? His hand instinctively reached for the small knife in his pocket, the only weapon he had on him. The dog stopped, its ears perked up. Kenny looked at the dog, and then in the direction the dog was staring. From the shadows ahead, a figure emerged, tall, menacing, and cloaked in black. The man's face was hidden by a mask, but Kenny could feel the weight of his gaze. This wasn't a random encounter. This person was here for a reason. The dog growled low in its throat, a deep rumbling sound that sent a chill down Kenny's spine. He tightened his grip on the knife, stepping back slightly. The man didn't move at first, just standing there in the shadows, sizing Kenny up. It was like a standoff, neither side willing to make the first move. Kenny tried to read the situation, but his mind was clouded. The man finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "You're not ready for this." Kenny's pulse quickened. "Ready for what?" he asked, trying to steady his breathing. The dog's growl intensified, but Kenny kept his focus on the figure in front of him. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, moving silently, like a shadow in the night. Kenny tensed, his knife ready, but the dog stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The dog's growl turned into a fierce bark, and Kenny saw the man hesitate. The tension was palpable. "Stay back," Kenny warned, his voice steady but his heart racing. The man paused, studying the dog with a strange intensity. He seemed to recognize something in it, something Kenny didn't understand. After a long moment, the man stepped back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this," the man muttered under his breath, before turning and disappearing back into the shadows. Kenny stood there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that guy? What did he want? The dog remained still, watching the spot where the man had vanished, its body tense. Kenny's instincts told him to leave, to keep moving before someone else showed up. But he had so many questions. "Let's go," Kenny muttered to the dog, who turned and began walking again without hesitation. Kenny followed closely, still trying to process everything that had just happened. One thing was certain, whatever this was, it was far from over. The chase had only just begun. Kenny's footsteps echoed in the empty street as he and the dog continued their journey through the quiet city. The earlier encounter with the masked figure had left him shaken, but there was no time to dwell on it. Every step brought him closer to something bigger than he could understand. The dog walked ahead, seemingly unfazed, its focus unwavering. Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that the dog knew exactly where they were headed. It was guiding him through this puzzle, step by step. And yet, with every new clue, the mystery only deepened. They reached a small park, the streetlights casting long shadows across the grassy area. Kenny slowed his pace, looking around for any signs of danger. The park was quiet, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But something in his gut told him this was another part of the mystery. The dog stopped near a bench, its tail wagging slightly. Kenny followed, wondering what had caught the dog's attention this time. He scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. The bench was old, worn by time, and there were no people in sight, just the dog sitting calmly in front of it. Kenny's curiosity piqued, and he kneeled down next to the dog, inspecting the bench more closely. He noticed a faint outline on the ground beneath it, a small indentation in the dirt. It didn't look natural. His fingers brushed the surface, and to his surprise, the ground shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. The dog looked up at him, as if waiting for him to act. Kenny reached into the compartment, pulling out a small weathered box. It was plain, nothing special, but it felt heavy in his hands. He stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to expect, before carefully opening the lid. Inside, there was another note, folded neatly. The symbol leads to the key. The gate is closer than you think. Kenny's heart skipped a beat. The gate again. What was this gate? And why was he being led to it? There was a sense of urgency building inside him. Every step had been a step closer, but to what? The dog stood, nudging Kenny with its nose, as if urging him to move. Kenny closed the box and slipped it into his pocket. He glanced around once more, sensing something more sinister lurking just out of sight. "We're not done yet, are we?" Kenny muttered to the dog. The dog barked softly, wagging its tail as it turned and trotted down the path leading out of the park. Kenny followed, the weight of the note and the box pulling at him. He wasn't sure who was watching or what the next clue would be, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was being drawn into something far more dangerous than he had expected. The path was leading him to the gate, and every step forward felt like a step deeper into the unknown. Kenny had been following the dog for what felt like hours, the streets growing emptier as the night deepened. The dog led him through the quiet streets, across alleys, and down hidden paths. Kenny barely had time to process what was happening. His mind was still spinning from the note, the hidden compartment, and the mysterious symbols. But the dog didn't hesitate, its focus never wavering. Finally, they arrived at a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. The building was old, its windows boarded up and covered with grime. It looked abandoned, yet there was something about it that felt alive, as if it was waiting for someone. The dog stopped in front of the entrance, sitting down and looking up at Kenny expectantly. Kenny hesitated. This was it. The building from the map, the one the dog had led him to. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, a sense of inevitability hanging in the air. He wasn't sure what was inside, but the feeling that he was about to uncover something significant, something dangerous, was undeniable. He pushed open the door slowly, the creaking of the hinges echoing in the silence. The inside was dark, the only light coming from a small flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The dog stepped inside, its movements smooth and silent, as if it had been here before. Kenny followed, his hand on his flashlight as he stepped into the room. The space was filled with old equipment, tables covered with papers and strange devices he didn't recognize. It looked like some kind of laboratory or workshop, but there was an unsettling stillness to it all. The dog moved toward the far wall, its nose twitching as it sniffed around. Kenny followed, shining the flashlight over the papers. They were filled with strange markings, symbols similar to the ones Kenny had seen before. But these were more complex, more detailed. It was like a map of the city or maybe of something else. At the center of the room, Kenny noticed a large screen, its monitor flickering to life as he approached. A countdown timer appeared, its numbers ticking down slowly. 0:58:27. Kenny froze. A countdown? He stepped closer, trying to make sense of what was happening. The screen was filled with blueprints, diagrams, and more symbols. In the corner of the screen, there was a warning message. Initiating sequence. The gate will be activated. Kenny's pulse quickened. The gate. He had no idea what it was, but it was clear that whatever was about to happen was bigger than anything he had anticipated. His eyes darted to the dog, which was now sitting in front of the screen, looking at him with steady eyes. The dog barked once, and Kenny realized that time was running out. He rushed toward the console, trying to figure out how to stop the countdown. His fingers flew across the buttons, but nothing seemed to respond. Panic started to set in. He wasn't sure what he was doing, and the timer was ticking down relentlessly. 56:20, 55:59. Kenny's mind raced. What was this countdown for? What was going to happen when it reached 0? The room was filled with a sense of impending doom, and Kenny had no idea how to stop it. As the seconds ticked down, he realized that there was no time left for hesitation. He had to make a choice, do something, anything, before it was too late. With a deep breath, he slammed his hand down on the biggest button on the console. The screen flickered once more, and for a moment, everything went black. Then the lights came back on. The countdown had stopped. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Something had changed. The gate was closer than ever, and whatever it was no longer just a mystery. It was a threat. The dog barked again, louder this time. Kenny turned to it, his heart pounding in his chest. The adventure was far from over. Kenny's breath caught in his throat as the lights flickered back on. He turned slowly toward the screen, his eyes locked on the blinking countdown that had just frozen. 0:00 it read, followed by a flashing red light. For a moment, there was silence, the weight of the moment settling in around him. He had stopped the countdown. Barely, but the eerie calm felt like the eye of a storm. The dog was still at his side, its stance alert, ears twitching. It seemed to sense that something was about to happen, something neither of them could control. Kenny's hand hovered over the console as he processed the events. What had he done? Had he stopped the activation? Or had he triggered something even worse? Before he could answer his own questions, the ground beneath his feet rumbled. It wasn't just a tremor, it was a full, deep vibration, like the entire building was shifting. The screen in front of him flickered again, but this time it was showing something entirely different, an image of a large, steel door at the center of what looked like an underground complex. The dog barked once, sharply, and Kenny turned just in time to see a thick steel panel rise from the floor, revealing another hidden passage. His heart raced. The door had opened, revealing a darkened hallway leading deeper into the bowels of the building. Kenny glanced down at the dog, who was already trotting forward, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Kenny followed, his mind spinning with questions. What was behind that door? What was this gate they had been talking about? There were so many things Kenny didn't understand, but there was no time to stop and think. Whatever this was, it was happening now. The hallway they entered was narrow and lined with old pipes that rattled and groaned with the vibrations from the building. The air grew colder the further they moved, and the feeling of unease thickened. Kenny could hear the distant hum of machinery, but it was muffled, as though it was coming from far below the surface. The dog didn't hesitate, moving with a quiet certainty, as though it knew exactly where they needed to go. The deeper they went, the more Kenny's senses were on edge. There was something alive down here. He could feel it in the air, an electricity, a strange pull that tugged at his gut. Ahead, the hallway opened up into a vast room. It was a large chamber, much bigger than Kenny had anticipated, and at the center of the room stood a massive cylindrical structure. It looked like a gigantic machine, gears and wires running up its sides, its surface covered with strange symbols. The dog stopped in front of it, its body tense, staring up at the machine. Kenny could feel it too, a presence in the room, as if the machine itself was waiting for something. Before he could move closer, the lights above them flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The hum from the machine grew louder, and Kenny felt a sudden surge of energy rush through the floor beneath him. His heart skipped a beat. Something was about to happen. He could feel it in the air. The dog growled softly, its eyes locked on the machine as the hum reached a deafening pitch. Kenny backed away, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the machine. It was as though everything he had been through had led him here. This was the moment, the key to everything. The answers, the dangers, the secrets, all in this one place. And then, without warning, the machine powered on. A burst of light shot from its core, and Kenny was blinded by the intensity. The air around him crackled, the room vibrating with the force of whatever was happening. The dog barked once more, sounding desperate, but Kenny couldn't move. He was frozen, watching as the machine began to activate. Something deep within the machine shifted, a mechanical sound rising as a massive door inside the chamber slowly slid open. Kenny's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what lay beyond it, but he knew this was no ordinary device. It was a gate just like the notes had said. The machine wasn't just a machine. It was a key, and it was opening something much bigger than Kenny had imagined. The dog's barking became more frantic, and Kenny snapped out of his trance, racing toward the open door. Whatever was behind it, whatever was about to happen, Kenny had no choice but to move forward. Kenny's legs carried him into the darkness, following the dog through the massive door that had just opened. The air in this new room was thick with the scent of metal and dust, but there was something else, a sense of ancient power, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The dog moved ahead, its paws clicking softly on the metal floor. Kenny followed closely, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The door behind them closed with a heavy thud, sealing them inside. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of lights embedded in the walls, casting long shadows that stretched across the space. They entered a large, circular chamber, and at the center stood a strange structure. It was a pedestal, like something you would see in an old temple or museum. But this one was far more intricate. It looked like a device with wires and glowing symbols running along its surface. It pulsed with energy, drawing Kenny closer despite his growing unease. The dog stopped a few feet away from the pedestal, its gaze fixed intently on the object. Kenny took another step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog looked up at him, then back at the pedestal, as if urging him to act. Kenny reached out, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the pedestal. The moment he touched it, the room seemed to hum with energy. The walls vibrated and the lights overhead flickered erratically. Then, without warning, the pedestal came to life. A hologram flickered into existence above it, casting an eerie blue light across the room. It was a figure, tall and imposing, with glowing eyes. The figure's voice was deep, echoing through the chamber. "The gate is open," the figure said, its voice reverberating with authority. "The key has been found. The time has come." Kenny's breath caught in his throat. What was this? What had he just activated? The figure in the hologram continued speaking, its words filling the room. "You have unlocked the path, but know this, those who seek the power of the gate are not without enemies. You are not alone in this." Before Kenny could respond, the hologram flickered and vanished. The room fell silent again, and the hum from the pedestal slowly died down. Kenny stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Enemies? Who were they talking about? What was the gate? And why had the dog brought him here? He glanced down at the dog, who was sitting patiently by his side, still calm despite the intense energy in the room. The dog seemed to understand far more than Kenny did. Whatever was happening, whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The dog turned and started walking toward the door at the far end of the chamber. Kenny didn't hesitate this time. He followed. Whatever the next step was, he knew he had to keep going. The gate was opening, and there was no turning back. Kenny followed the dog through the narrow passage that led deeper into the heart of the building. His mind raced as he tried to piece together everything that had happened. The countdown, the strange machine, the holographic message. It was all connected. But to what? What was this gate, and why had he been chosen to uncover it? The dog walked ahead, its movements calm, as if it had known this path for years. Kenny couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game much larger than himself. But no matter how much he questioned it, there was no going back. The dog had led him this far, and Kenny had no choice but to keep moving. They reached a large door at the end of the corridor. The door was heavy, made of steel, with intricate designs carved into its surface. Kenny could see the same symbols that had been on the dog's collar, the ones he had seen in the lab and on the machine. The door wasn't just a door, it was part of the puzzle, a key to whatever lay beyond. The dog stopped in front of the door, staring up at Kenny with steady, knowing eyes. Kenny hesitated, unsure of what to do next. He had no idea what he was walking into, but something told him that the answers were behind this door. He reached out and placed his hand on the cold metal. The door didn't open. Instead, there was a low hum, and the symbols on the surface of the door began to glow. The light was faint at first, but it grew brighter with each passing second, until the entire door was illuminated by the strange energy. The dog barked, breaking the silence. Kenny stepped back, his pulse quickening. The door was reacting to the energy from the pedestal, to the key he had activated. He knew this was it, the final step. He took a deep breath and placed both hands on the door. A soft click echoed in the room, and the door slowly began to open. A rush of cold air swept through the gap as it creaked open, revealing what lay beyond. Inside, there was a massive chamber, unlike anything Kenny had seen. The room was circular, with a high ceiling that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness above. At the center of the room was a pedestal, much like the one he had seen earlier, but this one was different. It was surrounded by symbols, glowing with the same energy that had activated the machine. The dog walked into the room without hesitation, its tail held low but steady. Kenny followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent, but he could feel the tension building, like something was about to happen. The dog stopped at the pedestal, its eyes locked on the object at the center. Kenny moved closer, his breath catching as he saw what it was. It was a key, the key, the one that had been hidden all along. It was the same symbol that had been on the dog's collar, but now it was a physical object, glowing with an energy that seemed almost alive. Kenny reached out to touch the key, but before his fingers could make contact, a voice echoed through the room. "You have found it," the voice said, cold and commanding. "But now you must choose." Kenny froze, his hand hovering over the key. "Choose?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "Choose what?" The voice responded, its tone ominous. "The key holds power beyond your understanding, but it comes at a price. You must decide. Will you use it, knowing the consequences, or will you leave it be, knowing that the path will remain closed?" Kenny's mind raced. He didn't know what the key could do, but the implications were clear. If he took it, he could unlock whatever lay beyond the gate, but what would that cost? What was behind this power, and what kind of dangers would it unleash? The dog turned to him, its eyes calm but intense. Kenny looked down at the animal, unsure of what to do. The dog had led him here for a reason. It trusted him, but did Kenny trust himself? The choice was his, and it was a choice that would change everything. Kenny stood in the heart of the chamber, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. The dog sat silently beside him, its eyes never leaving him. It was as if the dog understood the gravity of the moment, as if it had known all along that this moment would come. The key before him gleamed, its power unmistakable. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. Kenny could feel the energy radiating from it, could feel it pulling at him, tempting him to take it. Everything had led him here. Every clue, every moment, every decision. The path had been laid out, and now, standing at the threshold, he had to choose whether to continue or walk away. The voice echoed again, its cold tone breaking the silence. "Make your choice, Kenny. There is no turning back once you take it." Kenny swallowed, his mind racing. What was beyond the gate? Was it worth the risk? Could he live with the consequences if he unlocked something dangerous? Every instinct told him to leave it alone, to walk away and let this be someone else's problem. But the dog, its calm presence beside him, kept him rooted to the spot. The dog had led him here, guided him through the dangers, and now it was waiting for him to make the final call. Kenny's hand hovered over the key. For a moment, everything seemed still, frozen in time. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Was he ready to face whatever this key would unleash? Could he protect those around him if he took this step? His fingers brushed against the key. It was warm now, almost alive in his hand. The choice was made. Kenny closed his eyes and made his decision. He grabbed the key and pulled it from the pedestal. The moment he did, the entire room seemed to shake, the walls vibrating with a strange energy. A pulse of light shot through the chamber, and for a brief moment, Kenny felt as if he were connected to something greater, something ancient. The key clicked, and the ground beneath them shifted. The gate had been opened. As the light dimmed and the rumbling ceased, Kenny looked down at the dog, who was still standing beside him, its eyes calm and steady. Kenny exhaled, a sense of finality settling over him. He had made his choice, and the path ahead was now clear. What lay beyond the gate he couldn't know yet, but one thing was certain: the mystery was far from over. The journey had only just begun. The dog led him forward, and Kenny followed, stepping into the unknown, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.